If you want to be a working concept artist, an artist who uses their artistic skill in the pursuit of design, especially these days in the video game industry or the film industry, one of the biggest questions is how do you actually improve the design aspect of your craft? How do you get better at making things in a design process? That's what I want to discuss in this video. I think there are four main things that we have to consider here and four main things that you can build separately. And I think it's important to distinguish them as being separate. Let's jump in, get started. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and a lot of that has been spent as a concept artist, just drawing random things for video games mostly, but also feature animation and some film stuff. So basically in that case, what I'm doing is I'm using the drawing skills that I've built and, a lot of the design skills that I've built in the pursuit of working in a production environment and helping to design and figure out what the stuff in games and films, etc. should look like. Now, I made a video recently talking about art versus design, and my basic point there was that the design is the thing that will often make you the most money, especially if you just sort of want to get a job and work on, some sort of big project if you have a desire to work in the video game industry or something similar. The design is the thing that will actually often get you employed. The design is often the way that you provide value in that production chain. And I think it is the most important thing to work on and really get sorted. So the question is, how do we actually improve that? How do we work on getting better at design? And I'm talking specifically here as if we're getting better at design as artists, right? As artists who especially are trying to draw cool stuff from our imagination for, video games that have a high sort of fantasy quotient, right? Where we're designing monsters or creatures or things for science fiction and fantasy. That's sort of where I'm coming at it from. Now, the four things that I think are really important to consider are firstly, the idea of understanding and researching and becoming immersed in the idea of a design ethos. So this is where you can think about the theory of design. And you might go and read a whole bunch of different books, right? So this is where, you can think about the design as being a global concept. It's something that people access when, they're doing advertising. So, you could read something like Ogilvy on advertising. The reason something like this is important, and it's important to think of the design sort of theory and ethos, is that the more different elements you can bring into your game, the more unique and interesting your designs are likely to be. Often the way to create really interesting designs is through the thinking process. As I said in that previous video, it's often about thinking about functionality and functionality mixed with what other people think things are. And I think it's this general design ethos that you're going to find a lot of people in a lot of different industries talking about, from, again, advertising, marketing, architecture, automotive design. Again, there's a foundational concept there where we're sort of creating things for other people and our art has a high level of functionality. And I think the more you can read and research and immerse yourself in that stuff, the better your overall artistic and design process is going to be. Now, that stuff isn't going to directly, make your drawing or design better. It's more going to lay a foundation and an ability to kind of understand often what people are talking about and just to sort of allow your mind to see things from different angles. So for me personally, I might read Ogilvy on advertising, and again, it has nothing to do with designing monsters for science fiction games, but the things there that he's talking about are very much about how, ads and marketing and advertising sort of is viewed by an audience. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there that, look, it's not a one-to-one, right? It's not like you're going to read that book and that's going to be the how-to for concept design. But I think the more of that ethos of design stuff you can fill your mind with, the better you're going to be able to understand the process and be a little bit less intimidated by the concepts of, art direction, working in production environments, and especially viewing the audience and how the audience is going to view your design. Things that you can actually do to really move the needle and help yourself in this is potentially watch design-focused YouTube channels and try and view yourself as potentially being able to get more from watching channels and things that talk about design from different industries. What you'll find is that the types of concept art tips you're going to get from people who are really embedded in, the concept art industry is that there's a lot of industry specific stuff, terminology and process. And again, we'll talk about this later, but I think it's important to separate the idea of process, right? You may have heard things like doing, a series of black and white thumbnails, and, you pick one of those black and white thumbnails and then, you build that up, and people kind of think, well, that's concept design. And that's a process for concept design. And I think, if you go and look at architecture or, automotive design, which again can be quite similar to concept art, but if you look at those things, you will see the through lines and the similarities between all design processes. And even though it's a little bit more abstract, I think the more you can do that, the better of an understanding you'll have for it. So looking at architecture and looking at industrial design and trying to understand, like, why are those things good and how, did those people solve problems and create interesting solutions with different architectural problems. There's also a lot of, specific architecture that you can actually apply to concept design as well, because often we build buildings and that sort of thing. So the goal here with understanding this first concept of design ethos is to avoid getting too stuck in the weeds of concept art for video games. Because what you tend to find is everyone else is doing that. And if you want to build your design up, the more you can bring in from other disciplines, the easier your job is going to be when it comes to potentially being a little bit more unique, a little bit more interesting. Again, if you just stick to video game stuff, you're probably going to understand a lot of the industry specific things. But when it comes to bringing in extra design knowledge, you can quite easily get a lot of really good information just from studying these books, looking at how other people design things in different industries, and again, just trying to fill your mind with how people solve problems and the theory behind that, because people have been doing this for hundreds and thousands of years, and a lot of these basic concepts haven't changed. And if you learn them and you're able to sort of see them from different industry perspectives, it can be a really, really helpful tool in your toolkit. The second thing here is the idea of research. So what we want to do is develop a methodology of research when it comes to both the functionality of the thing that we're designing and, again, the iconography or the ideas behind what other people are sort of going to expect to see. So in my previous video, I gave the example of a pirate ship or something like that. But you could also use the basic concept of a pirate. So when you're researching, the trick is almost for you to actually figure out how you best understand the world. And this could be through visual research. But again, it's like, exactly how do you like to do it? If you really think about building a process and a system for yourself for how you research things, then that's like a skill. It's a habit. It's a process that you can go to again and again. And again, it might have layers. It might be about figuring out, if you do need to draw something really quickly or design something quickly, how do you get a quick read on what that should be, understanding the functionality and the iconography of that. And, as you work on a longer project, you might maybe read some books on the subject, again, about pirates, how they lived, how they approached life. And the more information you can get there, again, it's not always just about finding visual reference and creating a mood board. The better you actually understand the subject in detail, the more you're going to be able to sort of, again, extract little ideas out of there that other people aren't going to get if they're just kind of going to Pinterest and typing in something simple. So when it comes to research, again, I'm not really giving you any sort of quick how-to, but I'm saying you should view the research process as a skill that is separate from all the rest, that is much better if you tailor it exactly to how you think. You might be more intellectual, you might be more visual, you might in general be more interested in the iconography than the functionality. A lot of these things are in many ways related to what type of project you take on. If you take on a very cartoony project, we're never really going to get to the hardcore functionality. It's mostly about iconography. It's like, how do I make this little cartoony cute character feel like a pirate? How do I make this little icon of a ship feel like a ship? And in many of those cases, you're dealing with stuff that is almost an icon anyway, these little cartoony characters. So, you know, if you're very iconically minded, you like simplifying things, then that's where, again, you're going to be looking much more at the iconography of the subject matter and, you know, like what makes a pirate ship look like a pirate ship all the time, because those design challenges are actually really important. You know, you might have a whole bunch of little pirates or pirate ship for some pirate cartoony mobile game, and you got to separate them all out and sort of deal with all this kind of design work, but you don't have much detail to work with. Again, that's where understanding the iconography, the advertising side of it might be a lot more useful, and your research process might primarily focus on those visual things. How have other people solved these problems? And again, just looking for how to design that game and make it function. Versus if you're designing a realistic pirate game, that's where you might, you know, go in and read the books, because if you can extract a little bit of extra information and nuance from many of the great sort of books on what it was like to be a pirate in real life, then that is going to add an extra little layer onto your design that is just going to separate you out a little bit. And again, people are not necessarily always going to be able to see this or spot this, because the research process is specific to you. It's about how you think and how you can extract information out of there. So it's not that people who read books on their subject matter are better than people who don't. You might need to go to a museum. You might need to see it. You might need to lay hands on the subject matter. Seeing it in real life might be way more valuable than reading a book. Again, this is about you understanding how that functions and making sure that your research process is tailor-made to yourself, and that it allows you to improve your designs and make them a little bit more special. Just quickly, if you want to learn a little bit more about the illustration advice that I have, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It talks about some of these same topics, but mostly related to illustration and how I sort of go about getting more detail and polish in my work, which again doesn't have a lot to do with design, but you hear a lot there about my journey and kind of how I solved some of these overall sort of problems in my career and allowed myself to get my drawing to a point, again, where I could get these types of design jobs and, you know, handle the drawing side of this, which is a completely different kettle of fish. But anyway, check that out if that's something you're interested in. It's free. A link will be in the description. All right, the third thing that I think we can really separate out is the idea of the design process. So this is where before I talked about the idea that often if you really only are just following concept art tutorials, a lot of what you're going to see is process. People are saying, here is a design process. This is the design process that we use in the industry. And again, that can involve doing thumbnail sketches, doing multiple thumbnail sketches, then doing cleaned up thumbnail sketches, and then doing options for the different heads, etc., etc. And again, you might learn tricks in Photoshop for how to do that, you know, how to quickly create iterations. All of that stuff is process. It's technique. It's how you get the ideas from your head and other people's heads onto the page, and a lot of those things are very streamlined. You're learning a lot of efficiency. And efficiency is not necessarily what you want when you're beginning. I think when you're beginning, you really need to understand the design process behind that. I see a lot of people just following cookie cutter design processes and thinking that concept art is just about doing black and white thumbnails and then blowing that up and then rendering over the top of it. The thought process is far more important, and that's really what you need to learn. And I think you should separate out the idea of how you actually do that, how you actually take maybe a series of, again, you have amorphous ideas in your head. You have what people are expecting to see. There's what the project needs. There's how you think that maybe you could make this interesting for you as an artist. There's maybe some books you've read. There's some visual, language stuff. There's some iconography. There's some functionality. Trick is, how do you actually turn that into a drawing, right? And how do you make it so that other people can get involved in that process? And that's where, again, what we're doing is we're learning those concept art processes. And this, again, is something where you can look at someone else's process, but in many ways, a lot of that stuff happens in your own mind, and you are working through it as well as other people. And the main advice here that I'd give you, as opposed to just saying this is a separate thing, don't get it confused with understanding design or understanding how to find reference. Again, someone else's way of finding reference is not going to be yours, and this is the same. You need to find your own process and way of thinking through this. You can certainly use other people's processes, and you can learn really efficient, systematic ways of, turning vague ideas into more refined ideas. And there's nothing wrong with looking at how that sort of has been done. But don't underestimate how personal these things are if you actually really want to get good at this. And, for me personally, if I just use that standard cookie cutter concept design process, I don't really enjoy it. I don't feel like I get, results that are that sort of good. My process, again, it depends on the subject matter. I sort of know from experience what I need to do, and it sort of changes based on how much information I already have, how much I've done stuff that's similar before. It's very, personal, and it's really changes from project to project and what we need. So if we take example that concept of doing thumbnails, right, where we focus on shape and primary form, from a design aspect, you have to understand how all those things fit into a process. So working on big shapes and thumbnails first is really good if A, you're stuck and you're finding it difficult to push the larger shapes. And that can happen because you're drawing stuff and you kind of get jammed into thinking about the details and just breaking out and going, okay, I'm just going to do the silhouettes. I'm just going to design, 20 silhouettes on a page. That's a really good design exercise to break your own mind out of thinking about detail and also to ideate, what these different bigger shapes might be. So it's a good design tool, but it's not always the way that every concept art thing needs to start. Hopefully that's really obvious, but again, it seems to me from the stuff I see that is not obvious, right, based on a lot of tutorials. Now, the other thing there that you can use that for is in situations where the silhouette is a primary thing that you're designing. Now, this typically has been the case in video games, and especially where we have lower tech video games where you have to really push the silhouettes to make it clear what's actually happening on screen. So when we had very, very limited polygon budgets, if you're thinking about, your sort of Quake 1, probably not Quake 1, Quake sort of 3, that sort of PlayStation 2 era, focusing on the big shapes is kind of good because that's all you have. You don't have a lot of other ability to really effectively differentiate characters. And secondly, a lot of games were really fast-paced and fast-moving, and you need to focus on big shapes so you can tell the enemies apart. Similarly, if you're working on a mobile game, often you're dealing with tiny little iconic style characters, and again, just working the silhouette and the bigger shapes is really important. So depending on what project you're working on, that tool of focusing on the silhouette and ideating just the silhouette and sort of ignoring everything else can be really critical because it allows you to focus on the iconography of the silhouette and how that is going to effectively communicate what the thing is to the viewer. But that is not design. That's not the whole, that's that's not the whole thing. There's more to it, obviously, as I've said. So try and understand those tools, learn them, figure out your own, and experiment. Because again, if you figure out exactly what works for you, don't feel like you're not going to be able to work. You don't need to do exactly the same process that everyone else does, as long as you can involve other people in the process and iterate and ideate and be flexible. An art director doesn't care how you get the results. They don't care what you start with or whatever. Again, hopefully you'll have the flexibility there, but trust that you figuring out your own process and what works for you is going to be really, really important, and it's worth pursuing that and understanding that you're unique and your design process will be unique as well. The fourth thing is that you want to consider working professionally, the working side of it, as being almost a separate skill that you're trying to develop. And I think if you can get really good at the working thing, that often that's what will get you employed. You can always build your ability to get better at reference, to understand the design ethos, to read more books, to be able to converse in those, more ethereal design terms, etc. You can always, again, improve your process. But the thing that often people are looking for is, can you actually be useful on a team? Can you insert yourself in a production environment and add value? And I think this is where understanding where you actually want to work, how that actually functions, what the common technical limitations are in those production environments, and just in general, what people kind of want out of a concept artist in different industries. And again, this changes. It's not one of these things that's sort of fixed, but for instance, if you're looking at working in video games, you can be really good at the research, at understanding design ethos, at again having sort of design process. But for instance, a really big part of working in video games is understanding that the rigging for characters, for instance, is extremely expensive. So a big part of what we do when currently in video games is designing different variations of characters, but we have to design them in such a way that the animation rig doesn't interfere with the proportion. So you can't just design any character with any proportion, and there are often limitations in terms of what is easy to animate, what's not easy to animate. There are often points where, again, we want things around the belt line or something to stay static. We don't want that to expand too much. Why? Because everyone's going to use a common animation loop for picking a gun out of a holster or something. So we're going to have sort of different sizes and stuff like that, but you can't change the proportions too much. You can't change where certain things are because people just want to reuse animations, and if they can do that, that saves a lot of money. So just understanding, those industry common problems that you're dealing with and that often you spend a lot of time wrestling with as designers. The other thing that often happens is you see variations of creatures. The reason you see variations of creatures and monsters, and the prototypical one is just this one's green and this one's blue, right? And it's a different monster, and it's like the only reason for that is just it's expensive to design and animate and create two vastly different creatures. It's a lot more effective to design sort of classes of creatures and then sort of create variations on them. And one of the primary design skills that if you build will allow you to get really, not easy work, but will make it a lot more possible for you to get work in the video game industry is, figuring out how to make really interesting variations where you really make the character look different, even though it's based on the same base animation rig and to a certain degree the same base kind of model and everything like that. So, that's a skill where it's very industry specific, and it's very much about understanding what the production needs and how you can help on that production. And I would say, the better you get at that, the more employable you're going to be. But often when we're starting out, we sort of see just these big, the big art books. You see something like, I think this is like the Rogue One art book, right? And it's a pretty cool art book, but you're going to see a lot of stuff that's a little bit more flashy than that. You're going to see the stuff that looks really sort of cool And, look, that is a big part of concept art. But, a lot of what we do is wrestling with this. Like, how do I make this, like, ogre guy, look different? I got to do, like, 5 ogres, and I can't change this bit, I can't change that bit. I can change the face, but can't change it that much. And so, you sort of really work on, like, sticking bits on, or, making it feel like this one maybe lives over here and this one lives over here because, they've got different coloration, or, different sort of texture on their skin or something like that. So, that's where, again, the more industry specific you can be, the better you're going to be employable. And it's so important to view these 4 things as being separate, because if you work on them separately and you understand what's valuable and what is the most valuable, and maybe you're really good at some of these things to begin with. Some people are good at research. Some people are just really good at sort of working in teams to begin with. Personally, I'm not that good generally. I didn't come out of the factory good at working with others and sort of working within a team. I had to really work on that aspect of understanding that and trying to get good at working in a production environment, right? The drawing was kind of okay. Me coming up with my own ideas is kind of okay. Involving other people in the design process was something that, I really had to work on, right? So, for me, again, the functionality side of it is something I feel like I inherently sort of understood to a certain degree. When I was, drawing my pirate book, I went and bought, all these books on, how pirate ships are made. I tried to go and, find real cutlasses and real flintlock pistols. That kind of came easy to me. But again, working with others in a production environment was very, very challenging for me. And, maybe to a certain degree still is, I'm probably not the best at that, but all of these things are separate. There's 4 things. The first is design ethos, reading the books, understanding the design process, design history, looking at the history of design, understanding how design changes over time. Second is reference, understanding how you understand and get good at extracting information from the world so that you can create a nice understanding and collection of reference for each project. The third thing is the process, figuring out how do you physically take all that stuff, turn it into a finished design or a process for design, a range of sketches. Again, what are they for you? Do you want to do in the beginning a huge array of really sketchy sketches? Again, will that work? Is that what you want? Do you want to do, maybe that for yourself, but then, only do a few much tighter set of sketches that you send to someone? Do you want to render them? Do you want to do them in black and white? Do you start with color? Whatever it is, right? That's where your process is really important, understanding that. And the fourth thing is working in a particular industry. And just understanding that the design requirements, the skills you're going to have to build, and the processes you're going to really have to practice in order to get in the door, be useful as soon as possible, and hopefully make yourself employable and continually employable are really important. And that'll be different depending on whether you're working in, feature animation, feature film is, like live action is certainly very different. And again, working in, video games is going to be different, but also, working in realistic, AAA, highly detailed video games is going to be different to working in mobile games where things are often by default a little bit more iconic and a little bit more, symbolic. So you have to focus on different things. You have to tailor all that stuff that I talked about to a particular design process. Anyway, that's all I've got. Hopefully this is interesting. Let me know if these design focused talks help you, if you've sort of thought about this, if you want a little bit more industry specific knowledge, again, specifically about how you get good at doing stuff for video games, how you get good at designing stuff for animation, etc. Let me know, but that's all I've got. Catch you around. Happy drawing.